Today, household financial stress hits a new high in June. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is post covering finance and property news. Well, we've just run our models to the end of June related to our surveys, and today I'm going to walk you through the high-level results. I'll probably do a more detailed show later and drill down into individual postcodes, but this is my initial take on what is going on, and unfortunately it is not good news. So just to remind you that the Digital Finance Analytics core market model is driven by our surveys, and we survey 52,000 households over the year. That's 4,000 a month. It's part of an omnibus survey, and we get data back each week and then put it into our model. We can also slice and dice the data to be able to look at which types of households and where they are and how much trouble they're in down at an individual postcode level. And of course, we can also take a view as to where things might be going ahead as well. So we'll touch on our scenarios, at least at a high level. The core market model powers our home price scenarios, of course, and we take account of mortgage stress, the price trajectory, the buying and selling intentions, the migration data, and the economic data. We bang it all through the core market model in our scenarios, and that allows us then to form some opinions at a household level, but also at a postcode and more national level too. And I will just touch on a couple of scenarios towards the end of this presentation. And by the way, just before we get started, I am still providing our one-to-one service, and this is where we can talk about an individual postcode confidentially. I can't give financial advice, but I can share my data at a postcode level and talk about the underlying trends. And I can look at things like stress, home price trend data and extracts in terms of where the scenarios may be going. Now, we are taking bookings. It's an hour typically, either via Zoom or by phone. And there is a cost involved simply because there's a lot of work at my end to set this up. But if you are interested in having a conversation about a particular location, then you can contact me via the DFA blog, details below. We're booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead at the moment. Anyway, let's talk about stress now. And just to re-emphasize, as I continually do, there are many different definitions of how we talk about stress, from 30% of income or taxable income through to underwriting metrics. But we define stress in cash flow terms: money in, money out. If households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items and income, we define them as stressed. If they have a mortgage, then they're in mortgage stress. If renting, then rental stress. And investors with cash flow pressures are identified as stressed investors, and we can also aggregate the data to estimate total financial stress across all households at a postcode level. Now, we can talk about each postcode as a percentage of households in difficulty and also the number. And as I've discussed previously, I think the latter is a better measure, because what I'm interested in is where the big household counts are. The point is, of course, if you have a small number of households in a postcode, you might have a high percentage but a low number. Now let's then talk about mortgage stress as at the end of June 2023 based on our surveys. And the first thing to notice is that rental stress has really gone dramatically high again over the last month. It's now at 68.6% of households in difficulty. That's the highest ever. And it's interesting that we've seen it wobbling along over the last few months, but this has been a very significant acceleration, partly because of significant rental increases that are flowing through, and also the impost on households, many households these days, are from other cost categories. So more are in negative cash flow situations. That said, mortgage stress continues to grow as well. It's now at 48.6% of households, so not quite half of all those with a mortgage, but a considerably higher number than pre-COVID, when it was at 32.9% of households. And by the way, the RBA updated their situation with regard to the household debt ratios, and it's now 187.5 down just a little, but remember that this distorts because, of course, it's looking at all households and SMEs rather than just those with a mortgage. In fact, you'd have to multiply by 3 to get the average debt to income ratio. So it's typically 5 to 6 times, which is extremely high and explains why so many people have so much difficulty at the moment. Now, if we look at the June 2023 results, you can see that we've highlighted in yellow where the score's gone up from last month. And the first observation is that the grand total for mortgage stress is 48.6%, and that translates to 1.86 million households in mortgage stress. That's the highest I've ever seen. And across the particular states, there were slight falls in the ACT in New South Wales and South Australia and Western Australia, but significant rises in the Northern Territory, Queensland and Tasmania. Tasmania is looking really sick just now, as well as Victoria. If we then look at rental stress, what we can see there is that the percentage of households in rental stress is 68.66%, which is a very high number again. And that's more than 2,100,000 households in rental stress. Again, the highest they've ever seen. And across all states and territories, rental stress has risen, with the ACT and New South Wales up in the 70% range and Victoria in the mid-60s, just ahead of Western Australia at 64%, but Queensland is 67% as well there. Now if I look at stressed investors, there 22% are actually in difficulty. This is where those investors are having insufficient income from rental to cover the costs of the investment property. And in many cases, they are trying to sell their property at the moment. So we're seeing more listings of ex-investment properties. Interestingly, once again, New South Wales saw a little bit of a fall, as in Tasmania and Western Australia, whereas the other states there was a considerable rise. One of the things we're seeing quite often is that some investors have been able to reprice their properties higher, in other words, increase the rent. And whilst they might have swapped tenants, they've been able to generate slightly more income. And finally, the aggregated data, which is the financial stress, that's the combination of mortgage, rental and investor stress, is across the country at 47% of households. So that is at 4.6 million out of about 9.75 million households across Australia. And once again, we see that financial stress is lifted in every state and territory. Now, if we then look at our segments, and this is where we start getting into an understanding of the different cohorts. What I've done here is to highlight the most stress in each category. So young growing families, a lot of first-time buyers, of course, at 88%, which is more than 294,000 households with a mortgage. And also, it's worth noting that 72% of them are in rentals. That's another 150,000. So combined, you can see that there's a really large number of young growing families up against it. If I look at rental stress, we can see that the first generation Australians, the multicultural establishments, are actually at 76.3%, and that's more than 178,000 households in rental stress. We've also got quite a lot of wealthy seniors now feeling it. That's because of the cost of living is biting, and whilst they do have some assets, some investments, their income is insufficient to cover their outgoings at the moment. So around 169,000 wealthy seniors are in rental stress. That said, the largest cohorts of households in rental stress are in the suburban mainstream areas, as well as quite a few exclusive professionals, the more affluent and wealthy, and those on the disadvantaged fringe. If we look at investors, we can see there that a lot of young affluents are struggling with investment property. 41% have issues. That's 84,000 property investors who are young affluents, and they actually hold the prize for the highest proportion. Although if you look at the counts, you can see there that 97,000 exclusive professionals, 96,000 mature stable families, and 111,000 suburban mainstream households are all wrestling with the conundrum of investment property stress. And the aggregates at the segment level is 47.46%, of course, but it's broken down with 68.5% of young growing families, including a lot of first-time buyers, and young affluents not far behind at 54%, battling urban at 56%, and the multicultural establishment, first-generation Australians, they are actually quite high too. Now what I've then done is, as normal, broken out each of the types of stress, and this is of course mortgage stress, so we stack ranked it with a count of households. And I will make the point that we're now showing quite a few segments and households where 100% of households are actually in difficulty. Now, to be honest, our surveys are plus or minus a couple of percent, so it might be a little bit under 100, but we are seeing it so consistently now that we're actually reporting a number of postcodes at all households in difficulty. Campbelltown, postcode 2560, Leeds with more than 12,200. Then Liverpool, postcode 2170, Toowoomba 4350, Western Australian postcode 6065, including Tapping and Wanneroo. And then postcode 3064, Roxburgh Park and Donnybrook and Craigieburn in Victoria. That's in one of the outer suburban suburbs, along with Narre Warren and Fountain Gate, postcode 3805, and Berwick and Harkaway, postcode 3806. We then come back to Camden, New South Wales, 2570. Back to Victoria, postcode 3810, Pakenham. And then postcode 2765, including Riverston and a few other areas around there. Then to Cranbourne in Victoria, postcode 3977. Back to Victoria and postcode 3029 for Hoppers Crossing. And then Ballarat in regional Victoria, and Pine Mountain in Queensland. Now, I will just continue the list slightly. The reason I'm doing this is because some people ask me, well, what about some of those that were showing, for example, Ipswich was showing earlier on, but it's been overtaken. So there are a few that were higher up the list, like Point Cook and Derrimont a few months ago, but they slid down the list simply because so many other households in other postcodes have been hit. I'll make the point also that postcode 7250 Launceston is also on the list now, and with a very high proportion of households in mortgage stress, as well as Mackay up in Queensland 4740, and of course Ipswich, as I mentioned, is still there, Frankston in Victoria 3199, and Raglan in New South Wales 2795. If I then go to rental stress, the postcode with the highest count of rental stressed households at more than 13,500 is postcode 3000 in the middle of Victoria, in the middle of Melbourne. Then we come to Westmead, postcode 2145 with more than 11,000. Then Toowoomba 4350, Liverpool 2170, Southport and Labrador in Queensland 4215, Campbelltown 2560, and Hoppers Crossing and Tarnit 3029, Waterloo and Zetland 3017, Mount Druitt and areas around there, postcode 2770, Cooma in Queensland at 4209, Cranbourne in Victoria 3977, Point Cook and Derrimont 3030, Blacktown 2148, and then we go to Queensland postcode 4101, South Brisbane, and also then 4305 Ipswich. Then the Central Coast with Gosford 2250, postcode 2000 including Dawes Point and Millers Point, and Parramatta 2150. And once again, I've just extended that list down a little further because, again, some of these other postcodes were appearing in a few months back, but now they've been pushed down the list because of others coming through. So we've got Roxburgh Park in Victoria, postcode 3064, Narrabeen 2065, and Bundaberg 4670 in Queensland, Fortitude Valley in Queensland, Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst 2010, and so it goes on. I'd also make the point that postcode 2026 Bondi has more than 6,600 rental stressed households, and Launceston, postcode 7250, with more than 6,600, is also on the list. As I mentioned earlier on, Tasmania has a particular problem at the moment. If we then look at stressed investors, so this is, if you like, the other story from the investment perspective. These are the investors, and right at the top of the list is postcode 2065. That includes places like Crow's Nest and Greenwich, with more than 4,700 stressed investors in the centre of Melbourne, which is the yin to the yang we saw previously. Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst, Westmead, postcode 2145, Bundaberg, postcode 4670, and then we go to Mount Lawley in Western Australia, 6050, and Hornsby, 2077, Yatala in Queensland, 4207, Matraville, 2036, St Kilda in Victoria, Coomera in Queensland, Randwick in New South Wales, Lane Cove, 2066, Campbelltown, 2560, Carnegie in Victoria, and Ryde in New South Wales. If I take Ryde as an example, just over 40% of investors in that particular postcode are in difficulty, and that's more than 2,300 people who potentially might turn to putting their properties on the market, which could increase listings in those particular areas. If I then look at financial stress, which is the aggregate of all of the particular analyses that we've done, Toowoomba's at the top of the list, 4350, then Campbelltown, 2560, and Liverpool, 2170. Those following will have noticed that Toowoomba has pushed into first place with more than 25,300 households in financial stress. That's well over half of the households in the postcode. That said, 83% of households in Campbelltown are exposed, 87% in Mount Druitt in New South Wales, and pretty much everybody in postcode 2065 is having significant pressures. Next thing we're going to talk about is our scenarios, which is a way of exploring different futures and considering the consequences. They're not a forecast, they're trying to show you some of the sensitivities. None of these scenarios will turn out to be right, things change. And we use a framework driven by a core market model. And we're going to look at the latest potential outcomes with the latest data and results. And the scenarios run forward from today. So the best case scenario is that we don't see any increase in rates and we don't see the RBA lifting on Tuesday, and they fall next year as inflation eases faster than the RBA expectations, while wages rise faster and there's no recession in Australia. The base case is that rates rise to 4.35%, which would mean that mortgage rates were at 6.75 to 7.5% and stay high through 23 and 24, while inflation stays above target until 2024 with no recession in Australia. And the worst case is that rates rise even more, up to about 4.6%, which would put mortgage rates even higher, and stay high in 2024, along with inflation. Wages growth then stalls due to recession, and ultimately rates fall, but of course the damage is then done. So here is the home price scenarios based on 1 July data, and we are still projecting further falls over the next 12 months. Best case for houses over the next 3 years is a gross slide of about 5% over that 3-year period, but of course the base case is significantly worse and the worst case is dramatically worse. So it's just a matter of how the economics play out. Units don't drop quite as much, and we can just follow those through. So those are the house scenarios. The worst case scenario is a fall of 45% cumulatively over 3 years, which will be horrendous for many people. Units are tracking a fairly similar course, down about 4.7% best case scenario. Base case scenario, a fall of about 22% over 3 years. Worst case scenario, a fall of 39% over 3 years. And I would make the point that all the talk about property prices rising are actually cherry picking a small number of transactions, including quite a few more valuable transactions. In many areas, we're not seeing any significant improvement in home prices. They're continuing to slide. And if I just take younger growing families as an example, simply because this, of course, is where a lot of the action is in terms of stress, the best case scenario for younger growing families is for houses, maybe a fall of about 10% over the next 3 years. the base case closer to 30% and the worst case as much as 50%. Now, of course, these scenarios are just indicators. We'll see what happens. Units, quite similar, but not quite as dramatic a fall if you look at the worst case scenarios. Now, I will just also say that I too have my core market model down to a postcode level, and at some point I will run a more detailed live show where you can ask me about particular postcodes. But if you want to get information, hot information for a particular postcode, then you can contact me by my blog. Contact me there, give me the postcode, and I'll send it to you over the next few days. And that gives you a complete breakdown for a particular postcode as well as the scenario data. Now, there's just one other thing I thought I'd do, because I've now got my servers up and running, and that allows me then to show you some of the geo-mapping that I've got, because the geo-mapping is another way of looking at which areas are most impacted by mortgage stress. So I'm going to start with Melbourne this time, simply because I think Melbourne is one of the most interesting areas to look at in terms of what's going on. And one of the observations you can see almost immediately is that whilst there are quite a few hotspots in and around the Melbourne area and out to Ballarat, you can see there that a lot of the areas in Casey and places like that and towards the Beaconsfield area is a real hotspot. Those are the ones I called out earlier. To the north of Melbourne as well, and also, of course, to the west, around in the Wyndham area. And just to explain, the blues are low levels of stress, and the yellows and the oranges are higher levels of stress. So this now is the Sydney area, and you'll see that, of course, Western Sydney, from the hills and Blacktown down through Parramatta and areas around Liverpool to Campbelltown, is where a lot of the problems are. Remember, here I'm mounting the maps based on the total household count. But if you do drill into some of the areas closer in to Sydney, you can nevertheless also see that there are hotspots closer in as well. And even places like Bondi and areas around there, and Lane Cove, as I've mentioned, as well as some of the northern beaches, are all areas where there are considerable pressures emerging. Other areas are looking more secure. If I look at the Brisbane scenario, you can see that in and around the centre of Brisbane there are a circle of postcodes with some significant stress, but if you look out towards Ipswich way, you can see quite a lot of additional pressure, and of course Ipswich is one of the postcodes that I've been watching very closely. There's been a lot of pressure building there for quite some time. And if you drop down and look further down the Gold Coast, well, the counts are lower, but the proportion of households I discussed previously are still quite high. And there are areas in the blue where things are better, but there are also quite a few postcodes where things are getting considerably worse. Now, Perth is one to watch because a lot of people have been saying for some time that Perth is immune to some of the pressures. Remember, of course, though, that the peak of prices in Perth were in 2014 and things have then drifted lower. They're moving up in some areas now, but there's a big difference in and around Perth itself where there are relatively low levels of stress compared to the northern and southern reaches of Greater Perth, where there are high proportions of newly built property and a lot of people with very large mortgages under considerable stress. So I'm afraid that the story for Perth is certainly not as positive as some of the spruikers would have you believe. So there you are. That's what my modelling is showing. And just to explain the underlying drivers, obviously real incomes are not growing relative to inflation. The cost of living continues to rise. Cost of fuel and food, of course, are a considerable issue for many people. But also the mortgage costs are very high now. And what with the mortgage cliff and also quite a few people on variable rates being hit with bigger costs now, That's putting a big impost on households. There are more households working additional jobs and more hours to try and get by, and they're also hunkering down, putting more on credit cards and pulling money out from savings if they have them. But nevertheless, if this grinds on as I expect, and my expectation is that interest rates are going to stay high over this year and over next year and could go higher, then I think we're going to see considerable pain. And of course, as I discussed the other day, power prices are coming up again 1 July, and that means that many households are going to have an additional impost on their budgets. Now, as I've said before, it's very important if people are actually having issues with their cash flow, they don't just ignore it, but actually try to think it through. Step one is to build a cash flow so you can see where the money's coming in and where it's going out. Then you can prioritize and select where to spend and where not to spend, but it doesn't mean hunkering down and dialing back. And we're seeing many households who are doing just that at the moment. The other point I want to make is that if you have pressures, it's very important to get the right advice. And unfortunately, there are lots of spruikers on the internet who are offering, for a fee often, to provide advice or debt structuring, etc. It's very important that you pick the right advice. And my recommendation is the National Debt Helpline on 1-800-007-007. It's a government-backed service. It's free, and they do a tremendous job, of course, though they are very busy at the moment. But it's worth making note of that number if you have financial pressures. And the reason I'm saying this is because it's clear to me that we are not going to see any alleviation of these pressures at the moment. This is going to grind on for quite some time. My expectation is that we're going to see more people getting into financial flow stress in the months ahead as the interest rate rises continue to come through, as inflation continues to bite. I'm not sure what the peak is, but it could well be considerably higher from where we are at the moment. I will probably make a more detailed show later, go through some of this information again, and also give you more specific information about individual postcodes. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of what we found in the latest results, which are hot off the press, and watch out, you might well see a bit of media coverage over the next few days. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.